Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the screening and discussion of the documentary film Ruston Academy, From Dreams to Reality, directed by Tony Leal. My name is Jorge Duani. I'm the director of the Cuban Research Institute at Florida International University, which organized tonight's event. This documentary focuses on the history and personal experiences of the students of a bilingual American school that operated in Havana between 1920 and 1961. It's based on a book by the same title, written by the school's last headmaster, James D. Baker. We will proceed as follows for tonight's event. First, we'll watch a film which lasts about an hour. Then afterwards, I'll briefly introduce the members of our discussion panel who will share their thoughts on the documentary. And finally, we'll open it up for discussion with our virtual audience. The entire event should be over by about 8:50 p.m. Please note that you can submit your questions during and after the film screening by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. I'll do my best to raise as many of your questions as possible for our panelists. I hope you enjoy the film.
The Rustons were a brother and sister who in 1920 came to Havana at the invitation in a prep school that Mr. Ruston was teaching at the time. And it's the beginning of the history of the creation of Ruston Academy.
In 1920, when the Rustons opened their school in Cuba, in the neighborhood of Marianao, they did so with 3 students and 3 teachers. 40 years later, this school would be named by the Inter-American School Service of the United States Department of State as the best American school in Latin America. What justifies this level of recognition was the result of hard work and dedication by a team of educators led by Hiram Ruston, a Harvard graduate and experienced educator who was indeed a man before his time. His design and implementation of an individual-centered education program would nurture and help each student develop his or her potential, while making learning a rich and vivid experience.
Hiram Ruston was 51 years old when he started this journey in Cuba, and his life is just an incredible one. My mother once said that Hiram Ruston was the happiest man that she had ever seen. Not for all the things that he had or did, but that he enjoyed life to the fullest, but in ways that really were focused on service, on education, on concepts of education.
By the end of 1920, an economic crisis in Cuba forced a move to a small house in the neighborhood of El Vedado that became known as the He y Quinta building. For the next 10 years, this small house, with its bedrooms and open-air porch converted to classrooms, was the home of Ruston Academy, the Rustons, and of the few students in the initial boarding program who lived as a family in the facilities that by evening would become a residence. The school's sitting room at night became Mr. Ruston's bedroom. With a growth and expansion in the 1930s, new space was added with typical colonial houses similar to and around the He y Quinta facility. By 1946, Ruston Academy had become a school of about 400 students and 50 teachers.
There we had a transformation over a period of some 20 years Mr. Ruston was successful in drawing students, but as he drew more students, he needed more space. And he was fortunate that there were multiple houses that he was able to get for rent as he grew. And many of them were integrated. In other words, the main patio of the Hey Quinta building was connected to a garden that was on the other side of this wall. And essentially, Mr. Ruston created an incredibly complex scheduling in order to get maximum use from the buildings.
Mr. James D. Baker, who later became the headmaster of Ruston Academy, was working on his master's degree in English at Harvard after graduation from Miami University in Ohio. Upon the recommendation of the president of Miami University, also former classmate of Mr. Ruston at Harvard, Mr. Baker accepted Mr. Ruston's invitation to join him in Cuba as a member of the Ruston Academy faculty. 2 years later, his wife, Sybil Baker, followed him to Cuba and also became a teacher in the school.
By pure happenstance, somebody that had been a teacher of his in Miami, this is in Ohio, happened to have a friend who wrote to him and said, I'm running a school in Cuba and I'm interested in getting a man to come down here and teach. So they offered him a job, and in those days you didn't say no to any job. So he went down there. For him, first of all, it was a job, and second of all, it was an adventure.
They left Cuba in 1936 to return at Mr. Ruston's request in 1944, now with 2 sons and aware of the impending responsibility due to Mr. Ruston's deteriorating health. The Rustons determined that the ownership of the school would pass to the Bakers upon their death. Hiram Ruston passed away in 1946, and his sister Martha in 1951. The 1930s was a decade of growth and expansion for Ruston Academy. Its curriculum had started out as a tutorial program for a few high school students. Then came the development of a lower school, Bachillerato, Cuba's secondary education program, and the very innovative Comercio program, a combination of technical and academic courses that prepared students for immediate entry to the workplace. At the same time, a kindergarten was also added. The design and management of this encompassing curriculum evolved. Estela Agramonte was in charge of the Bachillerato program. Sybil Baker and Mario Iglesias, one of Ruston Academy professors, focused on the lower school. James Baker was largely responsible for the high school, and educators Felipe and Minerva de la Cruz and Mary Suarez developed and nurtured the Comercio program.
The quality of the teachers, more than anything, that made it, absolutely exceptional. The students are very good, but also, so I learned from my fellow students, but it was the professors. People like our history professor had a PhD in philosophy and history from the University of Heidelberg. That was Professor Boris Goldenberg. Our math teacher had degrees in physics and mathematics. Our Spanish teacher in Spanish literature. And they were absolutely dedicated to us. I've never seen anything like it.
When James and Sybil Baker inherited Ruston Academy, they began to implement a plan to change the school into a nonprofit foundation, modeled after the great private schools of the United States and England, and a total new concept for Cuba. This legal status would provide financial security and the basis to secure donations for those interested in the school, a group that already existed in an advisory capacity. Mr. Rafael Palacios and Mr. Phil Rosenberg, 2 very prominent businessmen and fathers, and grandfathers of 2 generations of Ruston graduates and alumni had been friends and close advisors of Mr. Ruston and later Mr. Baker. Both joined the foundation board, formally established on April 27, 1951. Mr. Palacios was the first president and laid the cornerstone of the new building. Mr. Rosenberg also served as president. Other notable and well-known leaders in the community were Elena Mederos, founder of the School of Social Work of the University of Havana, and recognized advocate of human rights causes such as women and children rights, and Herminio Portel Vila, prominent historian, writer, and university professor.
We inherited the school in after the death of his sister, and so we set it up as a nonprofit foundation. I guess it was the first educational nonprofit foundation in Cuba, and we turned the control of the school over to a board of directors.
Apparently, this was the first non-for-profit organization ever created in Cuba. So the document starts out with this long preamble explaining
What it is,
in legal terms what a non-for-profit is and how it really doesn't do this, and how it's 2 or 3 pages of very, very technical legal jargon.
My parents gave up rights of inheritance, which is what Mr. Ruston had set up, so that this foundation could be created and basically be the owner of the school. And that is, I think, a fact that very few people realize, that yes, it was a private school, but it wasn't privately owned. It was owned within a nonprofit structure.
Although plans for a new school facility were in Mr. Baker's mind before the nonprofit foundation, their help made the dream come true. The new Ruston Academy opened in a 9-acre site in Alturas del Country Club area on September 1955. Most of the money used for the purchase and construction of the new facility came from the profits of the foundation. Loans and help from the Ruston Academy community provided the final funding for the new school.
One of my father's dreams was to establish the resources to build a school that was really designed as a school and not as a series of private homes.
The new facility was designed by the firm of Arroyo y Menendez that had also designed El Palacio de los Deportes in 1957, the Havana Hilton in 1958, and the Teatro Nacional in 1960. Gabriela Menendez, a Ruston graduate and the first woman architect in Cuba, fully understood the philosophy of the school. Together with Mr. Baker, they preserved the valuable aspects of the G y Quinta spaces that often, by informal ways, influenced curricular goals and achieved Mr. Ruston's dreams of the school.
She evidently understood Ruston very well, because the spaces that were at Ruston, the fact that in the primary grades you had the classrooms fully enclosed with cross ventilation, a covered terrace, and then an open garden for each classroom, was a very interesting way to deal with education.
When the new Ruston Academy opened, its buildings, landscapes, and facilities reflected all the innovative philosophy, pedagogy, and curriculum that Mr. Ruston had introduced. He was fortunate to find in the Bakers the ones to carry out his unique legacy. A school and the education that takes place within its walls requires both a conducive and creative environment nurtured by its teachers. Ruston Academy provided both. As plans began to take shape, an American architectural firm reviewed the plans and recommended an idea taken from the old Ruston Academy in El Vedado.
My dad had never realized that the patio of the main building was about 50% of the Ruston student experience. that's where we interacted. That's where you picked up a lot of the cross-cultural
Socialized.
stuff.
Right.
Yeah. And the architect said, well, Jim, have you thought about your patios? And he said, well, patios have always they're just noise for me. Well, his office was right off the patio. But the architect said, no. That is, you have a spirit in this school that I can't design into a building.
One of the things that I think is true of the new Ruston Academy is that it was a modern interpretation of the elements of a traditional Spanish colonial house, as was the case of the old Ruston, which was an agglomeration of old houses in El Vedado, and how the basic elements of those Cuban colonial homes were interpreted and synthesized in the modern idiom to become the new school.
But when we moved to the new building near in La Coronela, near where we lived, it was just a phenomenal facility with beautiful grounds, with baseball fields, basketball fields, and I lived and breathed sports, Cuban music, and Cuban food. What else do you want? That's Ruston Academy.
In the new home, the realization of the perfect synergy between building and curriculum, both formal and informal, became a daily source of joy, pride, and happiness for all those involved: students, parents, teachers, and administrators. Mr. Ruston had started it all with successful innovations in the 1920s through the 40s. In the 1950s, with Mr. Baker at the helm, the curriculum was unique and complex, completely bilingual, bicultural, multicultural, co-ed, and non-sectarian. Values were imbued throughout in an environment that produced mutual understanding and tolerance.
Mr. Ruston all of a sudden goes to Cuba and opens a coeducational school. Coeducation was not a particularly practiced type of education in Cuba in the 1920s or the 30s or the 40s.
I think a very good thing that Ruston was bilingual and was co-ed, and there were other religions, peoples from other places and religions, so that at a very early stage we learned to behave and to be respected and be respected in a very easy manner.
I value the diversity that we had at Ruston, where everybody was a family, where we had people coming in from all sorts of venues in life. We had Americans, we had Cubans, we had Chinese, we had Jewish people.
So it was a nice mix. We were exposed to different cultures. There was no anti-Semitism that I ever experienced. As a matter of fact, most of my friends came to my bar mitzvah. To me, that's the normal way. And thank God that we had that mix, because we became very social. There was a lot of respect for each other.
Values that were not systematically taught, but we learned them. That idea of doing the best you can, of being, of pursuing excellence, the idea of we're all the same. There's no difference between the position of one student or another. There was a whole idea of equality and respect for others, tolerance.
Many times we try to say that Ruston was a bicultural or bilingual school, and I think it was bicultural because it gave you an opportunity, and this is very important to me, an opportunity to retain your roots while adopting another culture.
There was also this idea that the school was not bilingual per se, it was multicultural. And we ended up very early in our years in primary school with kids from England, kids from Italy, kids from Sweden. And that gave us a view of the world that was not typical of this little island that had maybe 5 million inhabitants, or for that matter, of schools in Havana.
We were receiving and practicing multicultural education when the terms weren't even used in an educational context of the times. So it wasn't just the formal curriculum that dealt with that, it was primarily our extracurricular activities that achieved this.
What it did have, of course, was the mix of foreigners that the other schools really didn't have, which many of the parents who sent their children to Ruston saw this as a great advantage.
There was a desire for higher education and a desire to learn about American culture. And I think that was a common denominator of both, and the reverse would be true of the American students who were learning about Cuban culture.
We had American friends, we had Cuban friends. You know, there was no tension. We're just total friends.
Eventually, what turned out, frankly, was a melting pot. In other words, and I'm not the one who has said this before, but it's been said that the Cubans became Americanized and the Americans became Cubanized.
I think we felt very much like Cuban. I think of Cuba even today as my home.
There are a lot of things that Ruston gave us. I think that the most important thing that Ruston did for us was to build our character.
Nobody knew if somebody was rich or was part of a scholarship or whatever. That didn't influence at all the way that friends were created, not at all.
Ruston was unique because it was not an aristocracy. I believe Ruston was more a meritocracy. If you came to school on the school bus, or whether you came to school driven by a private chauffeur, it didn't make any difference. If you didn't meet the academic standards, they would ask you to leave.
The reason I attended Ruston was because my father was employed by Ruston as part of the maintenance crew for the building. And as part of their deal, the children of the employees at Ruston were offered scholarships. And I must say that I believe very few people at Ruston knew that I had a scholarship. I was just part of the group. And Mr. and Mrs. Baker made sure of that, and I will always remember them with so much love.
I once told a friend that in Ruston Academy, the gardener merited the same respect that the director of the school did.
The sense of family relocated to the new facilities and students benefited from it. The faculty at Ruston Academy had a high degree of independence, creativity, and the freedom to innovate, which were critical to education at Ruston. In high school, one teacher introduced his students to poetry by exposing them to folk songs. In Bachillerato, another rewarded her students by reading them Edgar Allan Poe. One of the resident teachers offered an informal lunchtime introduction to philosophy on the porch of the residential area. And home teaching took on a new meaning when a math teacher worked with seniors preparing for the SAT exams every Saturday in the dining room of her home on a completely free basis. With these and many other examples, the Ruston dream was taking shape.
Marta Ferrer in mathematics, everybody knows that she ran for anybody that was going to college, she would hold a class at her home on Saturdays, Saturday mornings. We'd show up about 8 o'clock and we'd leave about 12 or 12:30. Goldenberg, he was quite a fellow. He was a fascinating person. He was a graduate or had gone to Heidelberg. He taught us history, okay, but then he pulled about 6 of us aside and he formed a Socratic group that met during lunch and talked about philosophical subjects. So we got into philosophy, something you don't normally do in high school.
Sybil Baker, as director of the lower school, contributed significantly to the initial individual-centered nurturing curriculum. She created a plan to improve academic skills, integrating extracurricular activities that enriched the students' experience. She taught music, came to the classes and had the students read poetry. She produced the plays and conducted the choral groups. This approach also included students learning carpentry, leatherwork, and taking art classes. Best said, in the words of a student, she knew every one of us and made Ruston truly our second home. With that wonderful laugh of hers, she let us know we were in a great place.
I think that there were two things that made Ruston unique. One was the fact that, as far as I ever perceived, everybody liked Ruston. And the second thing was that you learned because you wanted to learn. Somehow we were not made to learn things at whatever discipline it was. We were always encouraged, and there was always a desire on our part to achieve.
I always felt, even as a child, that my experience at Ruston was unique. I remember that very much so because it also brings to my mind the teachers that I had in my primary grades. And the fact that the experiences in the classroom and outside of the classroom were experiences that contributed to making me see education not as a burdensome responsibility at the time of being, when you're a child, but as a pleasant, joyful experience.
I learned even new ways of doing things that has even influenced me to this day. For example, you probably know that in Latin America, we don't tend to be very punctual. But at Ruston, they applied the American culture of punctuality, the importance of punctuality. And if we came late to class, we had to get a late slip. We would not be allowed back in class until we got this late slip.
Diverse tracks facilitated the curriculum goal of individualization to match student interests and abilities. The upper school's architecture reflected the diverse programs.
Then the other thing that I think Mr. Ruston committed to was to provide education for both sides. And what I mean by this is that once you got beyond the grade school level, there were three separate tracks. There was a high school, which was modeled entirely after the American high school system, which was really a preparation for college. It was the equivalent of a college prep school. On the other side was a system that was entirely modeled to the Cuban secondary education called the Bachillerato. And that was to prepare students to take the official Cuban examinations that they had to pass and prepare them for Cuban universities. And then he recognized a third need, which was there were a group of people who would benefit tremendously from the bilingual experience, but who weren't necessarily on the way to university. And we called it comercio. And what it did is prepare people who were going to become executive secretaries, accountants, business people.
We studied everything there was to study. In the Commerce Department, not only did we learn the skills that we needed to succeed in an office, but we also knew geography, and we knew history, and we knew current events. We were very diversified.
Mr. Ruston believed in the thorough mastery of academic skills and the importance of providing a background of knowledge wide enough to nourish and illuminate. His students knew the discipline of hard work and the joy of achievement. The students learned how to use their mind, to use languages correctly, to find solutions to problems, and relate the past to the present to the future. Learning by doing, an important instructional strategy, was illustrated in the emphasis given to the role that extracurricular activities and sports played in developing leadership and character, moral compass in the students. Collaboration, respect for diverse ideas, and tolerance for divergent views, as taught in the classroom, influenced student conduct. Mr. Ruston's legacy continued vividly with the Bakers and with each and every teacher who taught at Ruston.
When I was at MIT, I think, 1, 2, 3, 4, there were at least 4 or 5 students from Ruston at MIT. And that is one little school in one little country.
In 1972, I picked up a New York Times magazine that was talking about the best prep schools in the United States. And after they went through the list of about 5 or 6, it said, "We would be remiss if we did not mention Ruston Academy, a school in Cuba, which has been closed now for, 15 years, and it was the equal of any of these."
And why was Ruston so good? Why was it, on a teaching basis, better than Stanford, than MIT, and Harvard, the 3 major institutions where I spent my life before coming to Miami? And the main thing that differentiated Ruston from any other educational institution I've been involved in is the passion as well as the ability of the professors.
And if you talk to the students, they will tell you it was the teachers who challenged us. The difference between Ruston and other schools in terms of what they do to prepare us was that they demanded your best.
We had teachers throughout our stay there that showed us character.
The teachers were excellent. They taught me to be tenacious, integrity. They made learning a lot of fun.
The teachers were always very, very aware of what we were doing and how we were doing. And we were always very aware of our teachers.
Well, I think the teachers at Ruston were better. They were had more diverse backgrounds. They were available to the students and really cared for them. I think the students at the same time were more highly motivated by the teachers. And overall, I think the educational experience was a much stronger one at Ruston than at most other schools.
I was so touched by the kindness and the patience of the teachers that I don't think it was too difficult. It was an excellent school. There was not one teacher who was not trying to make us learn. And it was a blessing we could learn.
They helped me out, with my schooling. They were always ready to listen. They cared about the pupils. They gave them a sense of being important to them. And that I will treasure always.
Even though the student body had increased more than tenfold, the school's chief concern was still the individual student and their development. Events surrounding the post-Second World War era emphasized the importance of developing responsible citizens, and the curriculum focused more attention on helping students understand methods of solving problems.
One of the things that I think is part of the philosophy that sure goes back to Mr. Ruston. But certainly my parents were instrumental in maintaining it, was the philosophy that the most important part of education is to teach someone to think.
I've been a university president, and I still can tell you that it was that basic knowledge that I learned at Ruston that has guided me throughout my life.
I think that the education that Mr. Ruston brought to Cuba was unique. He was a man way ahead of his time, even in the United States.
With an increasing number of students, new teachers were often recruited from the ranks of graduates. These alumni reinforced further the Ruston cultural heritage and values that students embraced: tough academics and challenging curriculum in an environment of exceptional and loving teachers.
On the Bachillerato side, it was interesting to see that there were a number of students who had graduated from Ruston that eventually returned to Ruston as teachers.
Another group of alumni, the parents in the second generation in the family attending Ruston, were important and active collaborators in fostering the Ruston culture.
My parents met at Ruston. My mother graduated in 41.
My mother, Dorotea Chapiro de Tannenbaum, also started a kindergarten with Mr. Ruston, and till the day she died, which was February of last year, at 99 years old, she bled Ruston. So there was no choice. All four of us were going to go to Ruston.
Under the direction of James D. Baker as headmaster of the school, the goals established by Mr. Ruston remained unchanged. As an example, the annual Shakespearean play continued to be produced according to tradition, with the involvement of students, faculty, staff, and many parents sewing costumes. Also, innovations and high expectations went hand in hand with academic life. Mr. Ruston had certainly introduced plenty of both in his time. Now it was Mr. Baker's turn. He required and taught all graduating seniors in the high school and the combined Bachillerato and high school degree programs the college-level semantics course with a textbook by Samuel Hayakawa. The mere mention of the name Hayakawa inspired dread, but what a badge of honor it was for those seniors to succeed in that course.
We used to call it the course just plainly, Hayakawa. And I still have here with me the original book that I, used at Ruston. And I still, to this day, I read it from time to time.
I also remember Hayakawa. And this was a course that only those who were seniors in high school or in the Bachillerato high school combination program who were allowed to take this course. But that course actually wasn't taught at the high school level anywhere. In the United States, it was taught at the college level.
The miracle of Ruston did not happen by accident, but by hard work of all those involved. Among some of the innovative practices that made Ruston unique were the Parents and Teachers Association and the Alumni Association. But Mr. Ruston and Mr. Baker knew that the key to success was the partnership of the teachers, students, parents, and administrators' commitment to demonstrating to each student his personal involvement in their academic and personal progress.
And there is this interesting concept of partnership. Mr. Ruston met with every single student, and they go through the report card. And Mr. Ruston would say, oh, you're doing very well here, but what's happening over here? He knew every single student and what their needs were in order to make the needs that needed to be addressed in order to allow this student to attain the level that he had capability of reaching.
Oh, I met Mr. Ruston every month when he looked at the report cards.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was a pleasure too, because he read the report card very carefully. And then he looked at your face and he said, you can do better. You know, he knew what was the limit, what we could do.
When our report cards came out, they didn't just get handed out. Everybody sits there, okay, and here's Mr. Ruston. You go and you sit next to him. The nicest of people. You know, he'd look over your report card and, hey, you did okay here. And what? How about this? What happened here? You know? And he'd go over personally, kid by kid. And he was fabulous. He did that with every child in the school.
1959 began with uncertainty as terrifying events threatened Mr. Ruston's dream, the Bakers' life work, and the very existence of Ruston Academy. A nightmare began to envelop the island. By December 31st, 1960, the Cuban government had expelled the majority of the personnel of the American embassy. By then, most of the American and international students had left, many Cubans also. The embassy was closed, and 4 days later, Mr. and Mrs. Baker left for Miami. A skeleton crew continued to operate the school until early May 1961, when Ruston Academy was confiscated by the communist government. Those who lived through it remember the painful times.
See, Cuba was home to me. And I expected to spend the rest of my life there. In fact, I said at the time I left in January of '61, I was a Cuban American who was leaving home also.
I think easier for us than it was for our parents. I mean, we still had a life in front of us.
Right.
They had devoted their lives to building something that was remarkable, and then, you know, it was lost.
I'd come out of Cuba with 5 suitcases of clothes, and I had no money here, and 2 sons in college.
I had the privilege and the sadness of probably being the last student to visit the school the day the school was intervened, which I think was May the 2nd of 1961. I went to the school. And the enormous sadness of driving away and seeing, going uphill and watching the school and telling to myself, this is it, man, you know, there's no more Ruston. And the sadness was awful.
The building was no longer there to be our pride and joy, but the spirit of Ruston Academy and of James D. Baker was not trampled by the actions of the Cuban government. Mr. Baker, by the time he left, prompted by parents who were worried about the future of their children, became one of the initiators of Operación Pedro Pan. The underground network organized by Mr. Baker in Cuba was motivated by the need to get the children out of the country due to the pervading fear of communism that permeated Cuba at the time. 2 Ruston teachers, Margarita Oteiza and Berta Finlay, as well as leaders of American corporations in Cuba, assisted Mr. Baker in this very dangerous work. Monsignor Brian Walsh was Mr. Baker's contact in Miami. With his help, over 14,000 unaccompanied Cuban children were brought to the United States.
Operation Pedro Pan really came about as a result of the fact that my parents, particularly my father, had a very unique relationship with many Cuban parents. And those parents, or some of those parents, approached my father because they were concerned about whether their children were going to be indoctrinated in one form or another through Cuban education programs.
Many of them talked to me very honestly. In late November of 1960, a father who I knew was very much involved with the underground came to me and asked me if I could get a scholarship for his son to study in the States. And I said, sorry, but not that time of year. And then he explained to me that he had he and some of his friends who were working in the underground were willing to face all the dangers that they were facing, but they were worried that if something happened and they were arrested, thrown in prison, their children might be sent to Russia, because that was what happened in the Spanish Revolution. I thought about this for a couple of weeks, and then I decided to go to Miami and see if I could get some help, because at that time, a lot of the heads of American companies, especially those in Havana, were in Miami waiting to come back, because everybody thought they would be coming back soon. And so I went over and talked to a group of them, explained this problem, and they said, well, if you can find a place to open a school, our companies will support it. So I began looking around for the possibilities, and someone said, well, see Father Walsh, who's the head of Catholic Welfare. When I saw Father Walsh, I was very happy to find out that he was already negotiating with the government, the U.S. government, to set up a plan for a program like this.
And I was attending Ruston Academy until I was 17 years old. And in December of 1960, I left Cuba as one of the children in the program that Mr. Baker worked on to help Cuban children to escape the communist regime in Cuba.
I spent from early January to, I guess, the end of April, at the airport, about 12 to 15 hours a day, because I was there to receive any children that might come in.
As the Cuban Revolution evolved into an unpopular communist government, many families left Cuba for a land of freedom. As many Rustonians arrived in the United States or elsewhere, they faced unforeseen trouble as they left behind a country of intense natural beauty, a beloved school, classmates, and in some cases, their family. Their adaptation to a new country, in spite of the financial and other hardships experienced, was filled with pride and gratitude for the Ruston education that sustained them in the workplace or pursuing educational goals.
Because of all that I learned in school when I came to this country, I think my life was a little bit easier. I could work in an office instead of going to sew, because I didn't know how to sew. But, you know, a lot of the Cubans, when we first came at the beginning and they didn't know the language, what could we do? But fortunately, I did. And I had, since I went to the Commerce Department, I had my typing and my shorthand in both Spanish and in English, and I was able to work in an office.
I was very, very lucky, thanks to the education that I received at Ruston. When I came here, I applied for a job with an attorney in downtown Miami, and I was one of many applicants, but they told me after they hired me that they had never seen the level of the way that I spoke English, my knowledge, my shorthand, and my typing was impeccable. And I landed the job at $55 a week, and it was a fortune.
We would get to Winter Haven, and we were the only Cuban family there. And we're totally bilingual. I was just the beginning of 6th grade. I didn't do much in 6th grade, but I got straight A's. And those straight A's were based on the education that I had at Ruston.
But what Ruston gave me was the appreciation of learning. When I started in 9th grade at Nautilus Junior High School in Miami Beach, I was pretty well ahead of my class. And I think the education in Ruston, the fact that they focused on us, all the teachers were top-notch, there was no teacher aides or any of that, allowed me to continue ahead of my class all through college.
So I found in my freshman year in college that many of the courses that I was taking in college, I had already been taught at Ruston. So this was just amazing to see the level of academic power, that Ruston brought. The fact that, for example, my course in calculus, it was almost like repeating everything that I had at Ruston.
There were some restrictions at the time. You could only bring so much money out and one suitcase per person. But I think that possibly the most valuable thing we brought, especially when it came to Josie and myself, was our Ruston education.
Mr. Ruston and his successor, Mr. Baker, left a legacy, the pursuit of excellence. This trademark of a Ruston education is documented in the academic and professional life of the students. Presidents of major universities in Florida and California, a vice president of PepsiCo, educators, doctors, lawyers, ministers, a bishop, directors of U.S. government departments, journalists, architects, business owners, and entrepreneurs, and the list goes on, including a pilot, member of the pilot roster serving Air Force One. These men and women, when asked, would always credit their Ruston Academy education and the teachers who had influenced them.
I believe the Ruston Academy gave me a value system that has basically been a guideline for my life.
I think that one of the most important things that helped Ruston be so successful was the people that went to school there.
After I graduated, I went to work for a global company, and I traveled throughout Latin America. The education that they gave me is what really has allowed me to achieve, what I have today.
The legacy of Ruston Academy, as Mr. Ruston and later Mr. Baker envisioned, became part of the life work of some Ruston alumni. By 1975, many of them were well established in their careers, and Mr. Baker, with the help of Margarita Oteiza, organized a small team of Rustonians to work in the creation of a database of names and addresses that now amount to over 3,000 alumni, parents, and teachers. For the first reunion, 500 gathered from all over the world in the United States. The event honored Mr. and Mrs. Baker in gratitude for the education we had received.
I think one of the great things about Ruston has been the reunions, because basically leaving Cuba, where we all knew each other, and going to the U.S. and many other places, we lost track. But the reunions have been very helpful in terms of reconnecting with people.
Reunions continued to be held, but with every reunion, a basic topic of discussion came to be part of each gathering: the return to Cuba and bringing Ruston Academy back to a democratic Cuba. This idea motivated the founding of the Ruston Baker Educational Institution, or RBEI for its initials, founded in 1992.
And then in 92, we established an American board, nonprofit organization called Ruston Baker Educational Institution, with the idea that this group would carry on the work of Ruston and work to reopen the school whenever it would be possible to do so.
Dad became active, and I worked very closely with him on this, of resuscitating the board of the Fundación Ruston Baker. That's the Cuban Foundation. With the idea that we would possibly be able to return to Cuba to reclaim the property and to reopen a Ruston Academy there.
And of course, one of the things that is challenging about our new Ruston, which we hope to have someday, is that one of our very important jobs is going to be to try to help people understand what democracy is and to help prepare for democracy.
With the passing of time, the return of Ruston Academy to a democratic Cuba did not materialize. Instead, the board established new goals focused on documenting the value and importance of a Ruston education. Mr. Baker, with his son Chris and others helping them, authored the book Ruston From Dreams to Reality, capturing as much as possible the legacy of those who made the school and the programs that so effectively educated its students. The Ruston Baker Educational Institution continued the reunions and other activities that kept the memories vibrant and joyful, while also assuring the preservation of our legacy by collecting, organizing, and donating official documents, yearbooks, photographs, and other materials to the Cuban Heritage Collection of the University of Miami Libraries. To support the work of the library to organize and make accessible these records, individual alumni and RBEI made donations in memory of the teachers, the Baker family, and in honor of Hiram and Martha Ruston.
And I think that there is a very important direction that we took several years ago of defining part of what we're trying to accomplish is leaving a clear record of our legacy in the area of education.
We hope that we leave for other generations the merit and the value of this education, so that it can be emulated.
And we're, as they say in Spanish, poniendo nuestro granito de arena in this effort to share. What we did can't be replicated the way it was done in Cuba, but there's an awful lot that can be learned from that experience. To the class of 1957, some consider this a season of farewells, but to me, it is a happy time. I think not of your leaving, but of your taking Ruston with you wherever you may go. May her spirit and the ideals of character, personal values, and citizenship which Ruston has given you remain a basic part of your future and of your life of service. J.D. Baker.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed watching this film documentary. And now I'm going to be introducing very quickly the three members of our discussion panel, which we'll hear from in a minute. First, we'll hear from Tony Leal, the director. Tony is an award-winning bilingual producer, director, and writer. He is currently a TV producer, supervisor of video production, and adjunct professor at Miami-Dade College. Second, we'll be joined by Chris Baker, who you saw in the documentary, the son of James D. and Sybil Baker. Chris is currently the president of the Ruston Baker Educational Institution. He graduated from Ruston in 1959 and completed the publication of his father's book about the school in 2007. And you may have seen at the beginning that if you want to get a copy of the book, you can contact him directly at his email address, which will appear a little later on. And finally, we'll hear from Dr. Uva de Aragon, a prolific writer, educator, and journalist. And we just presented her latest her memoirs just a few days ago. Until her retirement in 2011, she served as Associate Director of our Cuban Research Institute at FIU. Born in Havana, she attended Ruston between 1956 and 59. And that same year, she moved to the United States with her family. So before continuing, let me invite you again to send in your questions by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And then I'll try to compile those questions and ask them after we hear the three discussants. So without further ado, I'll turn to Tony Leal.
Okay, good evening, everyone. As Dr. Duani just mentioned, my name is Tony Leal. I'm a producer now for Miami-Dade College, and that's where kind of everything began. So, but first of all, I just want to say thank you to Dr. Duani and also to Amy. And of course, you saw her name somewhere at the end, Eloisa Echezabal, who made this possible to work with FIU. And as you see, you know, this is hard labor of four educational institutions. You have Miami-Dade College, you have FIU, and you have UM, and also the Ruston Baker educational board. I don't remember the name right now, but you know how this came about, and I'm going to tell you a little bit of the story of how everything came out. I'm the producer of a show in the Miami-Dade College TV that is called Historia Cultural de Cuba. And the host, her friend is Celia Suarez, who you saw in the documentary. So she approached me to see if I could do a documentary about the school. Obviously, that was for the centennial celebration of the Ruston Academy, which founded in 1920. So it was for 2020. I agree because I'm that kind of person who can never say no to work. And coming from Univision, where I work here in Miami, also in Chicago, and also Home Shopping Network. So I can't be sitting down. So I took the challenge, and it was really a challenge because you have a group of people that really love their school. I could say that. I told them that I had not nightmares, but I had dreams of the school being open in Miami at one point throughout this time. But when what happened in 2020, we had the pandemic. And as a matter of fact, the last interview that I did, I went to Oklahoma, and it was Mr. Tannenbaum. And I was in the plane really nervous because I was hearing that everybody was getting sick. And so we had to postpone the centennial celebration until last year. We couldn't celebrate when it was supposed to. But during that time, we worked hard. You saw that there's a lot of pictures because we, at that time they didn't have cell phones and everybody taking pictures or video. So we had to rely on the pictures that the people from Ruston donated to the collection. Some of the interviews were done by those are the ones with Chris' brother, and the one with his father was done by FIU. So it was a really great collaboration. Some of the archival footage came from Wilson archives. So it was a labor of mainly love, because it was hard to, I had help because I had, as you saw, Maria Romagnac. She was in charge of giving me the pictures, the photo editor, because I didn't know anybody there. At the end, I already knew by looking at the kid who was that person that I interviewed. So sometimes I try to match the picture with the person that you saw on the documentary. But so Maria would give me the pictures. Some pictures were I had to Photoshop like I said, it was a lot of work. Thank God in a way that the pandemic happened, because then instead of having a year to work on this, I had 2 years. So even during the pandemic, everything was closed, and I asked for permission at Miami-Dade College to be able to go. The college was closed. I mean, I had to go to a hurdle just to get into the building to do this, because I wanted to make sure that it was ready for, I think it was November when they had their event last year. So, it was a lot of work. I actually had one of my cousins, or the only cousin that I have in Cuba, to take some pictures of the buildings as they stand now. So some of those pictures, I tried to have everything, black and white, so I turned them black and white. But some of those pictures were taken by my cousin in Cuba. And what you saw was a short version of the documentary. The longer version was there was a preview to the members of the Ruston alumni. But they're in YouTube, so if you want to see the difference between the two, there's not much. It's just timing. The other one lasts like an hour and 15, because at the end they have the pictures of all the teachers that taught at Ruston Academy. So, a lot of things happened. I lost my dad during the documentary preparation. And he was a person that, that always value education. And he had to leave his hometown of Matanzas, in Martín Matanzas, to work as a bricklayer in Havana, the tender age of 13. So he never finished school. But he self-taught, reading many books. He knew everything that you would ask him. And he did the same thing for us. When we lived in Puerto Rico, he made sure that we went to the best schools in Puerto Rico. He paid the education of all of us, myself and my brothers. So to me, it was a great experience that I was able to do this, because I pay homage to my dad, who passed away. It's going to be 1 year now. So I was battling all that, the pandemic. I also, since I value education too, I decided to go for my second master's degree while everything was going on, because I need to add something else to my life at that moment. So, I know that I have like 10 minutes to say something, but I just want to cut it short. I want to say thanks to Eloisa. I think I said that. And by the way, some of the people that are part of the documentary are related to somebody. You have the former FIU president, Dr. Maidike, the narrator. She's the aunt of Stephen Bauer. So those are the people that went to the school there. And to be able to be part of this was a great experience. And I thank Chris and Celia also for letting me do the job and, be able to, I was more like a director, putting all the pieces together of a symphony of different ideas and different people. But it was a great experience, because I got to work with, people who really love their school. And, I hope that I can find the same love of something from other people, because really I think, I don't think there's a Rustonian who doesn't love their school. And I saw it. I saw it not only with the people that I work, also with the people that I met during the event last year. And, it was a great experience. So I'll leave the floor now to Chris, and he would explain how the idea came out and whatever else he has to say. And thank you for being here tonight.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be able to share with you a production that could never have come about had we not had the assistance of Tony, as well as the support of University of Miami, of FIU, and particularly Miami-Dade College. It's difficult to review this, so I'm going to keep it very short, because I think
we need to let people ask questions so that we can fill in. And my comments will be limited to this. I think that there's no question that there was total unanimity in the fact that all people that were interviewed or who were to discuss this project identified the contribution of the teachers as the most important that we had at Ruston Academy. The program did not talk about another side that is related to expectations that the school had of its students. And the fact that everybody sought excellence was a very, very important factor and characteristic for the school. But then I think there's another part that actually Dencil Gartés mentions when he talks about the fact that Ruston Academy would not have been Ruston Academy without the quality of students that went there. So the school may have helped strengthen the skills of these students, but they themselves created the path to high academic accomplishment. And finally, there's one factor related to the school that probably, at least to me, is most important. That is, to me, the key to the success of students and of teaching at Ruston Academy was based upon the fact that no class was larger, had more than 20 students in it, which allowed for very, very close contact with teachers over the years and the ability to fill their cups to the full. And with that, I'd like to pass it on, and I would be more than glad to answer any questions that you might have. But you've already heard too much of me already. There's more than enough in the program that you've just seen. So we appreciate your interest.
Well, I think now it's my turn, but for some reason you cannot see me. So can you hear me? I will be
Yes, we can hear you, but we can't see you. Sorry.
Well, I've tried everything, and I've done this many times, and my camera is fine. I don't know what's the matter, but I hope you use your imagination. Okay, I approve. Let's see. My co-host is trying to control my camera. Let's see if that works. Well, meanwhile, I'll still speak. Like, have the idea you're at the radio. You're listening to radio. At first, I'd like to congratulate Tony Leal and everybody's been involved. This is the second time I watch it, and I really felt a great deal of emotion, even more than the first time, to see Mr. Baker's talking, to see the pictures of my old professors, to see some of my students, my fellow students when they were younger. It brought me lots of memories of 3 very important years of my life. I went to school at Ruston only for 3 years, from 56, from 59, but I can say that they were the most important years in my education, except perhaps my graduate work at UM. But during my youth, they really were absolutely key in my education. And there are just 2 points I want to make, because I think they other persons in the interviews have covered a lot of the same things I would say. That the years I was there was from 56, from 59, and it was a time of political turmoil in Cuba. And the school had students whose parents were in very different agendas or political parties or political positions in Cuba. It had people, it had sons of people who were in the Batista army. There were people who were with the revolution, were the daughters of the former President Prio. My father was in favor of elections. And all these students with different political ideas were able to, you know, have a very pleasant experience of respect for each other, of true democracy. And that's one of the other things that I think, especially in Bachillerato, was built, was a sense of nationality, of citizenship, of love for Cuba. There's this American scholar who wrote a book, I'm not going to say his name, who said that Ruston was a school that was some kind of plot of CIA to Americanize Cubans. I don't think so. I think in any case, it was more than the Americans got Cubanized. Then I think we were enriched by the American system and by the language and by the culture, but I never felt any kind of pressure to Americanize us or anything like that. I often argue with one of my cousins who tells me that we came here with nothing and all that we have accomplished. And I argue that it's not true that we came with nothing. We came with no money, but we had a lot of things with us. We had an education, and many of the participants had said it, that have helped us really make a new life in the United States. An education at a level that many people in the United States didn't have at that time. And I'm just going to tell you two stories of things that happened to me that show the kind of education I had in Cuba. When I was very young, before going to college, I applied for a job as a secretary, and there were many applicants, and they gave me the job. And a few days later, I asked my new boss why he had chosen me. And he told me that it was a time when they allowed to give people tests to apply for a job. I think that's illegal now. And he said that I was the one who had done best in the test, especially in the English part. And being a foreign person, you know, foreign and my second language, he was very impressed with that. And the other story is in 1980, when the Mariel boat leave happened, for some time, among the many things I've done in the United States, I taught English to these Marielitos. And sometimes they would ask me questions about rules of the language of English, and I would answer them. And then I say, how do I know that? And if I look back into my memory, it was something I had learned at Ruston Academy when I was 12 or 13 or 14. And finally, one more thing I want to say is that someone mentioned, and it's true, that the professor challenged the students, but that might happen in other schools. What was amazing was that the students were allowed to challenge the professors. We were able to discuss with them, to have our own ideas, to discuss with them, and they took it, you know, there was a mutual respect, a mutual dialogue. To me, I feel that those years that I was in Ruston, I blossomed. I was always a rather curious and strange child that had never felt really comfortable any place as far as school except at Ruston Academy. And I think it was because it allowed me to be myself. And I learned in the classroom, I learned from my schoolmates, I learned from my teachers. There was a lot of extracurricular activities, not only sports, which I wasn't good at all, but special courses during lunchtime. I remember a course of music appreciation that Mr. Midlash gave and really taught me a lot. A course of art appreciation at lunchtime by La Doctora Banatain that really opened my eyes to modern art. So there were all kinds of activities that really enriched our culture, enriched our curiosity. For me, it was an experience I'll never forget. Both my sisters also attended Ruston. and I know they feel the same way I do. And I'm sorry you cannot see me, but I'm all smiles to participate, even if without a face, in this very important event.
Thank you, Uva, and also thank you to Tony and to Chris for their comments, and especially for being so concise. So now we're beginning to have a Q&A period, and I see a few questions there. Before we turn to those questions, I wanted to take advantage of my position as moderator and ask you a few questions. And these are just open, so whoever feels like answering them can do so. I was curious at the beginning when the story about how the Rustons went to Cuba, the connection between the Rustons, Harvard, and Cuba. And I was wondering if you know anything about a previous connection, which was, if I remember correctly, it was around 1900 when Harvard created a very pioneering program for teachers, for Cuban teachers, mostly women, to go to Cambridge, take classes during the summer. I don't know if Ruston was aware of that, or if there were any other connections between himself and the fact that he was at Harvard. And of course, James D. Baker also went to Harvard. So I just wanted to raise that topic and see if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, there was no official link with Harvard. I think that Mr. Ruston actually had a great influence over my father, and I think had a great deal to do with sort of honing his interest to continue his graduate studies at Harvard. The only other link that I'm aware of is related to the school buildings and how those came about, but I don't think that was limited to Harvard.
Yeah, it's just very interesting that he chose that Ruston chose Cuba. He could have gone to Puerto Rico, he could have gone to Mexico, but it was Cuba where he decided to settle down.
Well, the interesting thing is that he went to Cuba because there was a student of his in an American, very progressive school in New York City that he had been exposed to a lot of progressive educational approaches and really brought a unique program to Cuba.
I just want to say that, and you should know more about this topic. Obviously, you talked about the Harvard, the teachers from Cuba. I think it was during the summer when they will go to. I did a show about that also, and I always felt that the Cubans had a preference over Puerto Ricans. You know, you talk about Viso Campos, who was a black Puerto Rican. He fought in the war and stuff like that, but he was treated like a second citizen, you know. But Cubans were able to go to the United States and be able to study, and those were the people that, you know, were in favor of many jobs in Cuba. So I think that that's one of the reasons maybe Ruston, and like, you know, what Chris said, but also he said, well, you know, there's a lot of Americans that used to go there. I have a good friend, a best friend of mine, born and raised here in Miami, and her dad, I think her dad grew up in Cuba for a time. You know, she's full American, well, you know, Native American here. Her parents are from Pittsburgh, and but somehow her grandfather went to Cuba to open a business, and her father grew up there. So there was kind of, I guess, this, you know, love with Cuba, and it was close, 90 miles from Key West. And you know, I in Puerto Rico growing up, the neighbors in the front of where I lived, they used to go from Havana to Key West to buy stuff for their store in Cuba. So there was always this relationship. So maybe that was part of the acceptance to go to Cuba.
And the other point I wanted to raise has already been raised by Uwa and also by Chris, which is everyone in the documentary said that the teachers were out of this world. They really were very happy with the teachers. And I was just wondering if you can expand on the quality of the teaching staff. Why were they so good? And one of the clues seems to be that, again, the groups were small, and the attention to detail, the fact that Ruston would meet individually to discuss report cards, that's very unusual. So were the teachers paid well compared to other schools in Cuba, for example?
I would say that they were perhaps slightly above the pay grade, but I think that the difficulty that you have with the students, rather with the teachers, is trying to identify what are the factors that allowed them to do such a good job. And I would say that, for example, teachers had a great deal of flexibility in deciding what to teach and how to teach it. And for example, we had one high school teacher who taught poetry, playing American folk songs. And, you know, this gentleman, Dr. Goldenberg, from Germany, actually originally from Russia, was, you know, he as well as Marta Ferrer, for example, in the area of mathematics, they just did all sorts of things that had nothing to do with the standard curriculum. And that allowed for much closer contact, I think, with the students that were benefited by the program.
It was mentioned a teacher that rewarded the students by reading Edgar Allan Poe on Fridays, and that was Margarita Oteiza.
Yes.
And I was in that class, and it meant a lot to me because since very young age, I wanted to be a writer. And I can say that that was how I learned how to write short stories. And I also like to mention the librarian. There was a good library and a good librarian, and I would, poor woman, she died recently, Doctora Romeo. I would go and ask her for books by Edgar Allan Poe, and I had read all the books they had about from Edgar Allan Poe, and she finally said, Uva, what are you looking for? And I said, I want to know how he writes his stories. He says, wait a minute. And she brought me another book which contained the theory of Edgar Allan Poe on writing stories, and it opened a world for me. So there was that kind of, you know, things that were not in the curriculum, and maybe at one student it didn't mean so much, but maybe for one student it changed their life. That reading of Edgar Allan Poe in high school, for me, it opened a whole world.
Great. Now, if I may ask one final question before turning to the Q&A, the issue of language and language education, bilingualism, multiculturalism came up several times in the interviews. And I wondered if you can pinpoint exactly how languages were taught. Was everything in English and then just a Spanish class, or was it like we do now in some places where you do half in one language, half in other? Can you expand on that?
Well, the challenge at Ruston was tied to the fact that your student body was not that stable, in that there's a great deal of movement by parents and families in and out of Cuba or Ruston Academy or whatever school that they went to. And what they created was a tiered approach. In other words, I might be in 7th grade of Spanish, being in 5th grade. And then there might be Cuban students who did not have the English skills to the same degree, but they had almost, it had to be
an approach that allowed for tailor-making courses to that what level that they were at. Now, one of the things that I find interesting is that if you talk to both either American or Cuban students, you find that a lot of their language skills were developed in social interaction during recess, as opposed to, or on the sports field, or, you know, lo que sea. But it required a great deal of flexibility.
And a great deal of code switching. A great deal of code switching, because you spoke both in different moments.
Yeah.
So there were no separate groups, Spanish groups and English groups. Everyone belonged to the same integrated language.
Well, it's Ruston started at kindergarten level and went all the way to 12. So that you have you have a program that is put together in order to take advantage of those similarities and differences.
Thank you.
But Jorge, for example, people like me that studied bachillerato and high school at the same time, we had to comply with the legal institutos exams that there was the same as public education, and it had unos exámenes eliminatorios that if you didn't pass the school exam, you couldn't go to the instituto. So really, you were very well prepared when you went to that. But then we had part of the day that was only in English. So we were doing the curriculum. Another story I'll say that when I came to the United States and I went to school, to a private school, I skipped a year because I had so many credits from studying bachillerato in high school that I never took another math class. I had I left the second year of bachillerato, and I just finished in 2 more years at age 16 because of so many credits that I had from Ruston. That was the level of education.
Great, thank you. So let's go to some of the questions for people who have been waiting for patiently. One from our colleague at FIU, Gene Rosenberg. He wants to know if there were any Black students enrolled at Ruston.
No, there were not.
And there's a comment by Judy Kreif and a question as well. She wants to know about Jewish refugee children from World War II who may have attended Ruston during their time in Cuba, and if there's any way to learn more about this.
Well, that's an interesting question. Yes, there were a number of refugees that came out in the late 30s and through pretty much through the war. And many of them only stayed for a bridge period. In other words, they could not go to the United States directly. They had to be coming from one country or another. But Cuba was one of the ones that many Jewish families selected, so that there is, in fact, a fairly high, when you talk about what was the diversity factor in the school, there was a very, very strong Jewish component to the student body at Ruston.
Okay, Ua, do you want to add something? Because I know you have personal experiences about that.
The first Jewish friend I had, I made it at Ruston. And unfortunately, she died recently in a very tragic way, Nancy Cres, in the Surfside building disaster, she and her sons. But she taught me a lot. I was very curious. I had recently read The Diary of Anne Frank. And it seemed to me in 56 that the war had been like years ago, which had just been like yesterday. 10 years is nothing. And I would ask her lots of questions. And I think I owe to her my tolerance to everything, everybody who's different or thinks different or is ethnically different, because we became very close friends. And until then, I didn't go to a Catholic school, it was a lay school, but all my friends were Catholic. And she taught me a lot about the Jewish culture, and I'm grateful to this day.
Thank you. Rosana Sanchez wants to know if there is a group of Ruston students or alumni in Cuba right now.
They're not organized as we are here in the States. I maintain a database to the extent that I can of people who attended or worked at Ruston. There are probably 8 or 10 students or former students who are still in Cuba, but it's relatively small. Most Rustonians were part of that group that came out in the early late 50s, early 60s.
Okay, here's a couple of questions related to the building, to the school and the building itself. One from Henry, who wants to know what is the school being used for right now, and maybe Tony can answer that because he has that cousin who took the pictures. And related to this, there's a question by Jean Rosenberg as well. If you know if the Ruston School building is being used as a school today.
Chris, I should answer that.
The answer is no. It is not being used as an educational facility. I regret to say that the building is now occupied and used as a training center for G2 intelligence personnel. It has had several reincarnations. At one point, it was a school. At one point, it was a training facility for sports education. But right now, a lot of the pictures that we showed of the facility at Hey Quinta, which was, those of you who are familiar with Havana, right next to the Hotel Presidente, was sort of the area where Mr. Ruston put together 4 and 5 different buildings to create a sort of a community right there. But the school is still in pretty good condition. The new school that was opened in 1955, but they have not allowed any of us access to the building.
Tony, do you want to add something? Yes.
No, I if my cousin told me, because obviously we kind of chat because they're members of the Communist Party, but and I don't want to ask him too much. But if he said anything, I don't know. I really don't know. The only thing that I know, the buildings are still there. Talk about pre-revolution construction. They're still there. They're close to the Malecón, the Hotel Presidente. So he knew where it was. So he went there and took the pictures. He lived there in 23, and I don't know, because I never lived in Cuba. I wasn't even born in Cuba. I was born in Puerto Rico. Like I told you, my parents are Cuban, but I don't know exactly what they're using those buildings for. But in Cuba, everything is multi-purpose. So
well, there is one. What was the primary school is now part of the Aide Santa Maria Museum.
Yes,
and
that's
that's
true.
right on the corner of Hey Quinta. And actually, what had been the primary, let's see, yeah, another building basically has been torn down, and where the bodega used to be, which is where the bachillerato program was run out of, is no longer there. I have some interesting photos that I took when I was there in 2003, and I was allowed to go up to the upper floor of the Hotel Presidente to get some aerial views. And there's just, it's hard to recognize.
Okay, so here's a question from Adriana Arias, which I think is probably addressed at Tony. Are there any plans to make more documentaries like this about other remarkable schools in Cuba, like the Edison Institute in La Víbora?
Well, anything that happens, at least in Miami-Dade College, sometimes I try to start the production, but some productions will fall in my lap, like this one. I had done one about the Holocaust, some of the people that survived the Holocaust, and they were living here in South Florida. And the other one was culinary, with a famous chef. But yeah, they can contact me at Miami-Dade College, and maybe we can start the conversation. Obviously, like this project, it takes a lot, because we didn't have video. Some of the video that you saw there is archival from the Wilson archives, but we can start the conversation. Right now, I'm involved in doing another documentary about the hotel's architectures in Miami, so I don't think that would happen anytime soon.
Okay, that leads me to another question that I had, which is, what were the schools that Ruston was most related to? For example, was Edison one of the sort of partner schools? Did they compete with each other in sports? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yes, we played in a particular league that included the Lafayette School, the
Phillips,
in some cases Savannah Military. It was a small league, but we didn't have Belen on the schedule, but we did have sort of our own league, which seemed to depend on whether you were multilingual or not.
Was Ruston any good in sports?
Well, yeah, yes, it was. It was very good.
Basketball, I think he played basketball.
In basketball, actually, there's one of the people interviewed, Ricardo Sanchez, who was a very outstanding athlete. But I've heard a certain amount of bragging about the fact that we were never defeated. and I a mí me cogen de bobo de vez en cuando, but that one, is not in the realm of reality.
Maybe the memory.
Did you have any link to Edison?
No, I think it was one of the attendees. I think her mom went to Edison.
Yes,
I think.
Adriana Arias
Yeah.
mentioned that question. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have time for one more question, and this is a very specific one, which is from Rene Costales. He wants to know if there were any spelling bee contests in English or Spanish associated with scholarship awards at Ruston.
Associated with what?
Scholarship awards. The main question is spelling bees. Did you have spelling bees at the school?
I don't remember any spelling bees. I do remember that there was a somewhat active American community activity around the 4th of July that focused on history, but it was U.S. history.
But there was, I don't remember any spelling bee, but there were many things fashioned after American school. For example, there was a school newspaper, the Rustonian. That's where I published my first article at age 12, when I was in Ingreso, and I was part of the staff. That was my first newspaper job. And when I came to the United States and the school stayed for another year, I would send a column every month called the Washington, and they published it in the Rustonian. And my first literary award came from a contest for short stories at Ruston. The award was that I could eat all the hamburgers I wanted at a nearby cafeteria called Billmore Cafeteria. And I didn't want to lose the little card they gave me, so I never went and ate the hamburgers because I wanted to keep the card. And they had a movie committee to show movies. They had a yearbook committee. They have a dance committee. So there were a student council committee. There was one year that was member of it. There was a debate club. So there were many activities that later on, when I studied my last 2 years of high school here, I realized how they were fashioned the same way as high schools here. And I think they were an excellent experience as mine as the staff of the Rustonian, and was really, and 1 year in the debate club, that really was.
Well, it's interesting that there were certain activities that were traditional, and one of them was a Shakespearean play every year, and that was of great interest to Mr. Ruston. And there are a number of pictures of him in the patio during a rehearsal for, I'm not sure which play it was, but it was part of the tradition.
Yes.
And there were additional plays that were produced in Spanish.
And sometimes we had like funny skits that we wrote ourselves.
Yeah.
And made up, and as part of the program. I remember that now that you said.
But I think the extracurricular activities were a very important part of the socializing process for us as either younger students or high school students.
I think not only socializing, but taking responsibility and knowing how to do things. I mean, if you had to put a little newspaper together and you had a deadline, and you had to have time to use the mimeograph, it was the way it was done then, you had to take responsibility. You had to divide tasks. You had some leadership skills. Whoever was the head, you had to make elections. You have to see, who would do what. So I think it was not only socializing, you learned a lot from it.
Okay, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and your experiences, Tony, Chris, and Uva, and thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you will join us in our next virtual or face-to-face event. And before we go, I think we're going to put up Chris Baker's email address again, so you can contact him if you want to get a copy of the book.
I wanted to share also that I put in one of the, I think for Adriana also, she wanted to know the director's cut, which is the one that you saw, is there on YouTube. I sent the address so you can copy that, or maybe the Cree can share it with everybody. But thank you.
Thank you again. Good evening, everyone.
Thank you, Jorge. Appreciate it.
There it is. Oh, there's our, that's Chris Baker's email address. Thank you all.
Bye.
night.